Warning, warning, this podcast contains spoilers.
Listen at your own risk.
Welcome to Medium Shift, the podcast that investigates how stories stack up from medium to medium through the adaptation process.
In today's episode, we ask, what if Superman, but bad? With Injustice.
Good, I quite like that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Welcome to Medium Shift. I'm Chris.
And I'm Ev.
And this episode, we are indeed doing the video game developed by NetherRealm Studios, Injustice, and also Injustice 2. Generally speaking, we are going to be talking about the, sub-franchise of Injustice, in that it consists of Injustice the game, Injustice the prequel comic, Injustice 2, and Injustice 2 the prequel comic. And then a brief Injustice 2 sequel comic, which I don't really want to talk about, but I guarantee we will. So
Yes.
Yeah.
And also Injustice Ground Zero, the different perspective view of the same story of Injustice.
Of course. From Harley Quinn's perspective in the first game, right? Yeah, that's right. Anyway, there's a whole series of different transmedia versions of this kind of parallel... basically, it's an Elseworld tale of a DC Universe story. So all that out of the way... What do you think of Injustice? Injustice the game, Injustice the franchise, Injustice as a concept. What do you feel about justice? not the game or anything, just justice.
Big fan of both the game and the concept of justice.
Good to know you passed the test. Anyway, yes.
Well, I'm scared. But no, I have been a huge fan of the Injustice series, and I think it also has a lot to do with my own internalized hype, because I first saw the game and I loved it because it was like DC, which is my thing,
sure,
and a proper game that was getting really good reviews. It was at the time the first Injustice was rated one of the best fighting games of the modern generation.
Certainly, yeah.
And so I got really excited, but I could never play it because I didn't have the right consoles, and my computer could not. I had a Mac at the time, so I couldn't run it.
The dreaded Mac curse when it comes to PC gaming.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I just kept looking at it. I watched and rewatched the cutscenes on YouTube. I found all the play footage. I found all the commencement stuff they did. They did a tournament beforehand to work out who's the best based on fan voting. I watched all of those.
Nice.
Yes, and I played the mobile game, which I will admit, at the time, was probably one of the best mobile games.
I have heard that. A lot of people have a lot of affection for that game. That was shut down recently, wasn't it? Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
They have Injustice 2 out, but it's not the same.
Sure.
The original one felt like a game where you didn't need to pay to win. You could pay, and that there was always that option. But at no point did I actually ever feel obligated or find it necessary to actually invest money unless it was something that I purely wanted to do out of the love of the game.
Sure. Yep. Which is generally the right way to do microtransactions, certainly. It is an optional thing if you want to support the game, but it should not detrimentally impact your gameplay experience.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so that's what I did. It's one of the few games where I actually went, you know what? I'm okay with them having my money because they have provided a good experience.
Sure.
So, yeah, and that was my thing. And eventually, I did get myself a proper computer laptop that I could run Steam, and then I could buy the Ultimate Edition, and I played it, and I played it, and I played it. And it did quite lead into my expectations quite heavily. They met them. It even exceeded them a little bit in some parts.
Awesome.
Even though I did hype it to oblivion in my head. And, yeah, I just found the whole concept really enjoyable. And that's... coming from me, who has never really been much of a fighting game fan.
Certainly, yeah.
I've never been good at it, and I've never really sort of found one that I find really enjoyable aside from Injustice.
Fantastic. No, awesome. I do find that's a really fascinating way of experience a media product. That happens to me a lot as well. Like, I don't tend to be much of a console gamer, so every time like a console exclusive comes out that I'm really interested in or invested in, I do a similar thing to you, where I don't necessarily play the game, but I experience it through all of the different trailers they put out, and then eventually I watch a walkthrough or something like that. I did something similar for Injustice and Injustice 2 when it came out as well. So I did actually play Injustice eventually as well. I really enjoy it too. Similar to you, I'm not a big fighting game guy. I think outside of something like Super Smash Bros., which has a much lower barrier of entry, the more complicated, combo-heavy type of fighting games like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat and Injustice, I don't find quite as appealing. I think it's it is incredibly skillful when you see really, really talented people use it. I just do not have the skill to pull that off. So for me, it's a little bit of a button masher, but I think the way they use the DC property and the characters and the designs and a lot of the animations is just fun and enjoyable enough for me to actually take pleasure out of both those games, despite the fact that I am not very good at them. So yeah,
and I think you're really right. Good. There is a huge part of sort of the experience that factors into how much you appreciate mostly video games, because they are so different. And the first time I actually played Injustice, it was at a video game bar with some friends on a birthday, where we basically made a makeshift tournament with some other guys who were drinking at the same bar, just out in the back, and played. And that was a huge experience. And I think that's why it sort of solidified that experience, because it could be a button masher, but you could also, over the time, slowly learn little bits of combos, and you just know enough to be able to get by and actually make something interesting.
Sure.
And I think that was the right sort of barrier for how to get into the game. Like, I still have not mastered it, and I don't think I ever will master it. But there's enough to actually make you feel like everything you do is by design.
Sure. Yeah. There are still ways that you can enjoy the game and the gameplay experience beyond just literally pressing random buttons at random time.
Yes.
And yeah, certainly, I think that has a lot of merit. But I think ultimately the appeal for me for the Injustice games is not the fact that it is a fighting game. The appeal to me is the story, surprisingly enough, for a fighting game. And just the way it uses the DC property and everything, because obviously I'm similar to you, big fan of the DC universe, love everything Batman related and such. I think the story, especially in Injustice 1, is really strong and really fun in a lot of ways, even if it is kind of hamstrung by the fact that it is a fighting game. And that I find is the ultimate appeal. And I think, once again, is kind of a really interesting use of that license for that exact reason. So, yeah.
I love one of the things in the actual story section of the game and how it breaks up gameplay and story is everything is done through chapters based on one particular character.
Sure, yeah.
And so, at least in the first one. In the second one, it does the same thing, but it lets you sort of choose one or the other and sort of follow that path.
Yeah.
Which then leads it into, by the end, its own branching sort of storyline.
Yeah, Injustice 2 has two different endings for people who don't know. Yeah, based on whether you side with Batman or Superman. Yeah.
Yes. And it's that kind of thing which I really love, and how it sort of factors in perfectly with the medium as a story, because it means you get even like replays of the same bits, but from someone else's perspective, doing it on a different side of things. And so it does something that movies sort of tend to struggle with sometimes. There are some great movies out there like Run Lola Run or Rashomon, or those others, where you get that idea of the same events but from different perspectives, but it's not the same as when you can just pick up and be the one in control of those perspectives to get a whole new grasp of everything that's going on.
Yeah, certainly. Player agency is really intoxicating in that respect. Yeah, the type of narrative you're talking about there is Forking Park narrative, which games are inherently about, because, like, say, for example, you can play through one level in so many different ways in different permutations, which creates essentially, like, different stories every time you play the game. So, and yeah, Injustice, in some respects, takes advantage of that. I don't know if it takes enough advantage of that, but that'd be something to get into and do it differently. But yeah, no, you make a really good point. Yeah, awesome. Well, now that we've got that generally out of the way, our first impressions, do we want to kind of start moving into not necessarily the sources, but kind of the way it uses the DC universe onto itself? Because this is interesting, because it's based on DC properties, but it's not based on a specific story in any concrete sense. This is not a true adaptation in that way.
There are a lot of there's been a lot of stories in the past which involve the Justice League and what if they were bad, and multiple universes and the such. But every single one of them has their own sort of unique twist on everything, and none of them really can you can sort of make a case for them being adaptations of one another, but they all seem distinct enough that you can also go, oh no, they're just sort of a similar concept to create a new story in its own right entirely. And so you sort of got this mixed dynamic of, is it an adaptation or is it just part of the same sort of idea, same continuity?
Sure. Like, it's a new twist on a classic story in that respect. Like, what if Superman, but bad, is not a new idea and has happened a lot throughout comics as well? As a big Superman fan, generally, like, thematically speaking, how do you feel about those stories? Those ones when it kind of looks like it... Because Superman is constantly upheld as, like, this beacon of hope and humanity and, like, the best possible person you could be. How do you feel about stories that kind of basically take him down to earth and turn him into an antagonist in many respects?
Again, I feel... I've said this before when I talked about Superman, but Superman is always best when his stories are grappling with ideals and concepts rather than just straight fistfights.
Sure, yeah.
That's because he's a god trying to be a man. That's his whole deal.
And that's what makes him interesting.
Yes.
Not the fact that he can punch someone through several buildings at once.
No.
Yeah.
So the stories that still keep on to that and try and use the story as a means to actually tell a parable or to go through with, like, questioning and deconstructing and reconstructing almost philosophical ideas around the concepts of good and evil, they always tend to still succeed like a regular Superman comic does. And the ones where it's just, oh, he's the bad guy, and how do we fight a bad guy that can punch people through walls?
Sure.
They, again, seem to just sort of fall off the radar, as they tend to do.
Yeah, fair, because it's not looking at Superman in an interesting light. It just makes him a super powerful obstacle, basically. Yeah. I see.
One of my favorite what if Superman but bad stories, and it's a famous one for a reason, is Superman Red Sun.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah.
Because...
Well, that's not technically him, Superman but bad, but Superman but just morally ambiguous.
Yeah.
In some ways. Yeah.
Well, it is sort of Superman but bad if you look at it from a very sort of USA-centric standpoint.
Western perspective. Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
Not even necessarily Western, but specifically the USA at that time, dealing with the Soviets in the Cold War.
Yep.
And where they themselves were the heroes of their story. And they basically just went, okay, but what if your figurehead for the US and hope and freedom and everything you talk about, what if we put him through a communist-style regime and he's still the same person? And it really sort of plays on the fact that, you know, communism and Stalin, yes, it was also very bad, but they also, you could see where they were coming from. And the people weren't all evil. They were just regular people, and they sell themselves as the heroes as well, in the same way the US does. And it was a deconstruction of both of the clear black and white morals that were sort of going along with this Cold War, and showing that actually, both sides are kind of dicks, but also kind of good.
There you go, and that's how how that story succeeds for that reason, because it talks more about ideas. Superman Red Sun is great if people haven't read it. Yeah.
And so the stories where Superman is bad in those situations and it plays on the ideas of black and white morality, I highly recommend finding those out because they are fantastic. Awesome. And that's what I think Injustice kind of sort of does. It is a straight more Superman is a tyrant. Yeah. But they give him sympathetic motive onto why he does that. In the comics, at least, it's not just straight he goes evil. There's a build-up, and you can actually feel why he's doing all this stuff.
There is a descent, I guess, in some respects, yeah. You're referring to the Injustice prequel comics?
Yes.
So, yeah. So the opening of Injustice, for people who aren't familiar, like, it starts, basically, the main continuity. Joker basically blows up Metropolis, kills Lois Lane, and then gets Superman to kill him, essentially. And then...
Technically... he puts the detonator in Lois and gets Superman to kill Lois, thus setting off the bomb and essentially making Superman blow up Metropolis.
Sure. But it's Joker's intention, certainly. Like, he manipulates Superman into doing that.
But in Superman's head, he feels like he's the one that has done that.
Yeah, certainly. And then, from then, the game cuts 5 years into the future, where Superman is basically, the head of this totalitarian regime. If I did have to put a criticism in the original game, now, I haven't read the prequel comics. The prequel comics for Injustice takes place in that 5-year gap, correct? Yeah, so... I felt Superman was too much of an antagonist in the first game. I didn't quite feel the sympathy at certain points, especially when he kills like Captain Marvel. At that moment, I'm like, this is almost like the shoot the dog scene. Like, you know that scene in like which every villain in like a bad 80s action movie has where they do something outlandishly, ridiculously evil that makes you despise them? It felt like that moment, and I don't think I wanted that moment because it took a little bit of away of the ambiguity. But you've read the prequel comics, correct? Yeah. Does it feel a little bit different once you have that context?
Yeah, I certainly feel, because even at the beginning, he is making the world a better place. He is actually just going in there where politics can't fix the issue and goes, okay, this is what's happening. And he actually does, to begin with, start making the world more of a utopian style situation. But it's as it gets further down and outside forces interfere and corrupting forces get in there, he ends up sort of flicking the switch and going, well, these people can't keep the utopia themselves. I'm going to have to enforce it.
Sure.
And that leads into the totalitarian and turns the utopia into a dystopia.
Sure. Yeah.
And you could see all the corrupting forces. And it's not super... It makes clear what is not super clear in the video games. Like Wonder Woman being essentially more of an antagonist than Superman.
Yeah. Almost like the more sinister person whispering into his ear.
She is the Lady Macbeth in this scenario.
Exactly. That's a good analogy. Yeah.
And so that scene you were talking about where he kills Shazam, my entire thought process behind that is, okay, now he's officially gone on the irredeemable path. And at this point, there's no way of actually bringing things back on track. They're going to have to end in a final showdown.
Sure.
So I was kind of okay with it, even if he was killing a 12-year-old boy.
Yeah. A little bit. Yeah. In a really kind of horrifying way as well.
Yes.
Like, it's not even just, like beating him or something like that. Like, essentially suffocating him. It's real bad. Yeah, I'm not sure. Part of me wonders that I didn't necessarily want Superman to go down that irredeemable path. Like, I think, even as we were briefly talking about before, what's so good about Superman Red Son is that he is ultimately still a very idealistic individual and still wants to do right by the world and things like that. It's just kind of the system of power and the influences in his life have kind of shackled him in certain ways. And I kind of wish Injustice kind of went a similar route in that respect. And that'll get into, especially as you were talking about before, you can see things from different perspectives and things like that. Like video games, because they are inherently interactive and give players a level of agency in the narrative, means that they can take things in, new and interesting perspectives that allow you to follow different characters at different times and like take sides on issues and things like that. And they kind of do that at the end of Injustice 2 with the two alternate ends. But even in that context, Superman still feels like an ultimate antagonist. Yep. And part of me kind of wishes that he was a little bit more morally ambiguous in the first Injustice game, and the way the narrative played out and the way the player could interact with that narrative supported that ambiguity as well. So yeah, I mean, ultimately, I still think the storytelling is really good for the most part. But that, if there was one criticism I had to label against the first game, that would probably be it. Yeah.
I'd be interested to find out, because one of the characters I found really compelling in the first Injustice, and then in the second Injustice as well, was the Flash.
Yeah.
Because he's the one that actually goes through that sort of moral ambiguity and actually does turn his back on the League, essentially, and joins Batman, but also is still deemed responsible for the atrocities that they caused.
Yeah.
And there's this whole thing of, can a person be fully redeemed? Can they not be? What's going on? And that plays into Injustice 2, and I find that really compelling. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I really like that arc. I just wish it was an arc that could have been given to Superman, or if a little of that kind of more idealistic, we're doing the wrong things for the right reasons kind of thing was more apparent in Superman, especially in Injustice 2, when at that point it feels like Superman is entirely irredeemable, and wildly antagonistic. Like he talks like a supervillain in Injustice 2, and at least in Injustice 1 he didn't quite get to that point until after he killed Captain Marvel. I kind of wish they gave Flash's arc, or at least elements of Flash's arc, to Superman, but it doesn't make me like Flash's arc any less. I do think that's definitely a really big strong point in the first game. Yeah.
And, of course, you kind of know what I'm going to say now, but my other favorite character and arc in this story, of course, was Green Arrow.
Big surprise.
Mainly because he's the one that didn't have his counterpart. Because in the comics, in the prequel Injustice comics, and how they allude to in the actual game itself, Green Arrow was essentially the first casualty of Superman.
Yep.
And the way that's sort of done is really interesting as well. In the comics, he was stealing the kryptonite pill that ends up basically giving the insurgency a fighting chance.
And also a video game equivalent justification of the fact that why Batman can withstand Superman's punches.
Yep.
Yep. That's a whole other gameplay. You could almost call that a ludonarrative dissonance thing, but not quite. Yeah.
So I found that sort of interesting. And then you have the Green Arrow of Prime Earth coming over and just like, oh, I'm essentially the heart of this, and when I'm gone, this can actually happen. And very much, and that moment where it's like, well, this had to be when Batman of the Injustice universe is like, well, this had to be kicked off by something, and it's sort of the realization that, oh, I died. I'm not dead, but I'm also dead.
Yep.
That's a whole another issue in itself.
Yeah, it's kind of, it reminds me in a similar way to the way they've played John Connor in some of the better Terminator movies. As he basically has to confront the idea that he will become the savior of the future in that respect. And I think that's a really interesting ideological point. Yeah, no, it's a really good point. One of the things we're kind of skirting around, we should probably talk about the sources a little bit more, I guess. Because even though this doesn't draw specifically from a storyline, it kind of draws from what I guess you can call like the baseline continuity of the DC universe. So this happens with a lot of like properties, like the Justice League animated series works in a similar way and things like that, where there is kind of like a baseline continuity where all the characters like in a certain location and things like that, which other mediums draw from. So in this case, like Batman has a Robin and he's protecting Gotham City, and Superman's in Metropolis with Lois Lane. Like it is the most conventional and normal understandings of the characters and their status quo. And that's kind of what this game is drawing from, rather than any specific stories. So I don't know if there's a better way of articulating that in some respects, but
I kind of feel you. We've sort of talked in the past about the idea of the sort of cardinal functions of adaptations.
Yeah, cardinal function is a good way to describe it.
Yeah, as in the functions that basically you feel have to be in an adaptation in order for it to be a correct adaptation.
Sure.
Or to be changed in such a way that it provides really compelling ideas. And what you're talking about seems to be almost like the baseline story as a cardinal function. Like this is what happens as Superman as a whole. It does not exist. It's this ethereal idea of like a Justice League story or a Superman story or a Batman story that he is the crime fighter in Gotham or Metropolis with the parents that are either dead or on a farm. That sounds like a euphemism. It really isn't.
On the farm in the sky.
And so it's sort of this weird sort of combination that only really affects the big franchises across multiple mediums because you need that sort of, it's almost like the skeleton story across all the adaptations. You can throw them in just about anywhere, but there are certain functions that have to exist in order for it to feel like it is, or if they take it in a direction, it's going from this same story.
Yeah, certainly. I think the best way to articulate it when we talk about like the cardinal functions, like the baseline story where things draw from, are just the assumptions you can make about a character when you see a film. Like, really good example of this and the way a film plays with this is in Spider-Man Homecoming, in that we do not see Uncle Ben killed. We do not see Peter Parker's origin. We do not see him get bitten by the spider. But it is such a natural part of our understanding of that character that we can fill in those gaps without the movie having to fill it in for us. And that's kind of what happens in Injustice, like especially in the opening scene when, you know, Lois dies and it sets everything off and things like that. We kind of know implicitly everything that has happened before. Like, we know, like, Superman's from Krypton, we know what's happened to his family, we know where Batman's coming from, everything like that, because it's such a baseline, as you say, cardinal understanding of the character. And then they've just changed this one radical thing and it goes from that baseline. Like, the best way to describe it, especially for Superman, is that the opening sequence in All-Star Superman, when it's just those few sentences that perfectly summarize his origin. I don't quite remember what they are now, but is it like Dying Planet?
Yeah. Dying Planet, Loving Parents. I can't. Oh,
Last Son.
It's Dying Planet, Last Son, New Parents, something like that.
Yeah,
and the image of the planet blowing up, the spaceship, and Martha and Pa Kent.
Yeah.
I can never remember his name. It's always just Pa Kent.
Yeah, that's what we know him as, the Dead Kent.
Dead Kentities.
Yeah, but I mean, like, that is one of those things, like, All-Star Superman does a similar way, where you just have this this baseline understanding of the character. And I think, ultimately, that is how Injustice works, not only in the Injustice universe, but also the parallel Earth where you draw all of those other characters from. We implicitly know where all those characters are coming from, because even if it isn't based on a specific story, especially if you're a DC fan, you implicitly know everything about these characters already, and it's not deviating from it, and if it does deviate, it explicitly tells us.
Yes.
Yeah, so keep going.
Okay, yeah, there's this baseline assumed knowledge that plays into all of this, that even if there's sort of that cultural zeitgeist where even if you don't read the comics or don't watch the movies, you just kind of know.
Yep.
And that's where everything plays off of.
Exactly. And I think Injustice does a really good job of not only having that as a foundation, but then playing off it as well. Yeah, so... which makes it, once again, like one of those really broad adaptations that it is less about adapting a specific story than it is adapting... kind of like an Elseworld story, basically.
Yeah.
Like, it's taking the universe in a slightly different direction. And I think in that respect, it really works. Were there specific, like, other evil Superman stories you wanted to talk about? Like, ones with other similarities, or...?
Well, there's always going to be the ones that keep propping up. There's the Crime Syndicate,
Sure.
which is another alternate evil version of the Justice League that comes into the mainland Justice League to wreak havoc and take their place, almost, which has been adapted. That's in comics. It's sort of got semi-introduced with Justice Lords, which is also its own story as well.
Sure.
Which was part of, again, became a Justice League episode, Justice League Unlimited episode. I can't remember which one.
It might have been Unlimited. I think there's a movie as well.
Yes.
Crisis on Two Earths.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is also a sort of Justice Lord thing, and there's a lot you can talk about in terms of this. And of course, nothing really sort of sticks out in my head aside from some of the classics like Red Sun. Even sort of Kingdom Come in a way.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah.
You can sort of look at that. That's not bad. Again, that's not Superman gone bad. That's just the battle of ideals that you sort of need. And
Certainly.
I feel that's sort of a good one to sort of look at, because that's Superman almost attaining more control. But in this case, it's sort of more of a religious parable-esque scenario, and he doesn't go full bad. It's just a debate on theology.
Yeah, certainly. There's another one as well, which I'm kind of thinking of, is the Superman in Dark Knight Returns.
Ah, yes.
As well, obviously, where Superman has kind of become... once again, it's less about Superman is a threat, and Batman facing Superman in the end is obviously a big part of that comic. But Superman itself has kind of been turned into a government stooge who just generally does what the US government wants, which is once again kind of a play, an inversion of truth, justice in the American way, because he is technically still standing for those things, but he's doing things that are some may also perceive as unethical in some respects. But yeah, no, I think for the most part, this is very much kind of an original take on evil Superman, but it is in a similar vein to so many of those original stories. So one of the ones I definitely do want to talk about, one of the other Superman stories I really like too, is What's So Funny About Truth, Justice in the American Way.
Oh, I absolutely love that story.
It's so good. And what is so great about that story, so for people who don't know, it's basically about this kind of this new supergroup that comes on the scene who kills people, and the public favor kind of starts turning against Superman, because it seems like these new people are basically better at his job than he is. The whole comic is all about essentially looking at Superman as like an old-fashioned figure, someone who doesn't really work in contemporary culture the same way he did when he was first introduced. But what's so good about that is at the very end, Superman kind of does this presentation when he pretends to go evil to take down that group. And in doing so, kind of shows the sheer terror of what exactly would happen when he basically takes away the constraints on his powers and everything like that, which is essentially what Injustice Superman represents. I think it's a really, really great story, and people who, especially for people who are not big fans of Superman, which I am, which I am not, sorry. I think it's one of those stories that can kind of make you appreciate the character in a new and interesting light. So, yeah, that's just one I wanted to throw out at the very least.
Yeah, I highly recommend everyone go both read the story and watch the animated film that they made.
Which is called Superman versus the Elite.
Yes.
Yep, awesome.
Because they are fantastic and I absolutely love it. I love Manchester Black as a character, so much so that I got dressed up as Manchester Black and got a photo with Tyler Hoechlin.
There you go.
Who, for those who don't know, is Superman in the latest Supergirl series.
Yep, it's super cool.
Yes.
Awesome.
Such a big fan.
All right, shall we move into Do It Differently then?
Yep. Jingle.
Yeah, nice. All right, do you want to go first or shall I?
I can go first because I'm probably going to be quick this time because there's not a whole lot I do want to change. I'm not going to bore you too much with the long and short end of this because, like you said, it's a video game, so there's already all this sort of alternate perspective and stuff with the story and the way you play it dictating that. So my few... I guess they're essentially nitpicks or small adjustments that I'd make. So, one, I'd have Superman, like you said, be a bit more sort of morally ambiguous in the thing and focus more on sort of Wonder Woman as the antagonist.
Okay, sure.
Really make her that very Lady Macbeth style. This is war. We're doing this for the betterment.
I'm still not sure how I feel about that version of the character as well. But yeah, that's another thing too. So, yeah.
And I would bring in what happens a lot in the comics, but never seems to be touched on, is the role of Sinestro in the video game.
Yeah.
So I would have him also be another major sort of antagonist. If anything, I'd have, at the end of Injustice, him be the big bad of the thing.
Oh, really?
Because his whole deal is playing with fear. And that is kind of what happens. In the comics, there's a great moment where Superman basically puts on a Sinestro Corps ring and seemingly kills Black Canary after she almost takes him down. Because, she's fighting for Green Arrow and for the rest of the insurgency and everything, and she broadcasts it to the world to show, and it's the turning point where they go, oh, we're no longer in a utopia, this guy is bad. And they all start fearing him, but it makes him more powerful. And so I'd have that sort of aspect more clear in the video games, and also give Black Adam a bit more to do.
Sure.
Especially because he becomes a big part of Injustice 2, and you sort of need to, I feel, set that up a bit earlier.
Yeah, that makes sense. I could see that. Yeah.
So those are my main ones for the first game. And then the second game, which we didn't talk a whole lot about.
No.
But it's there as well. Also, just continues on. It's great.
It's still pretty good. I don't think the story is quite as strong for the most part.
No. So this one changing a bit more. I like the stuff they do with Supergirl in this one.
Sure, yeah.
So I'm keeping that and keeping Brainiac as sort of the big bad because that just kind of works.
Yep.
In this scenario, and that sort of branching, coming together, enemies working together, and then branching off again. But I'd sort of try and seed in sort of can we go back to the way it was that they talked about in the game, but didn't seem to go on. It basically was part of their Act 2 was that, but their Act 2 felt like an hour compared to the rest of the 4 or 5 hour game.
Sure.
Which, campaign mode at least, which just didn't feel like the adequate enough time to fully explore that. So that I'd make bigger, and then put in more of a moralistic standpoint in the final battle. Don't make it so clear that Superman is just going back to how things were in his sort of regime idea, and Batman just going, no, things can be great. Yay, team insurgency. And actually have sort of even possibly a third branching storyline where we follow almost Supergirl as she sort of tries to hit a middle ground. But yeah, that is kind of where I go with things.
Sure, fair enough. I could see that. I mean, for me, at the very least, I'm kind of similar in that I want to play more on the fact that it is a video game aspect and essentially turn the first Injustice game into an interactive narrative. The way, at least I define interactive narrative, obviously games are inherently interactive, but there are kind of 2 levels of narrative when it comes to games. There's the emergent narrative, which is what happens when, like, say, for example, you're playing Super Mario Bros. You jump on a Goomba, you walk along. That is part of the emergent narrative because it implicitly happens as you were playing through, like, it is part of the gameplay, basically. Whereas the scripted narrative of Super Mario Bros. Is Mario is trying to save Princess Peach from Bowser, and that doesn't change depending on how... Yeah, sorry. That doesn't change depending on how you, like, play through the emergent narrative, per se. So Injustice 2 can be described as an interactive narrative because it changes the sequence of events, the scripted narrative, through the two alternate endings. And I kind of want to take that idea and expand on it in Injustice 1, in that every single time there is basically... kind of turn the story of the first game into a much larger, like, basically branching tree path of story, where every single time there is a fight, you basically get to choose which of the people you want to play as, and depending on whether you win with that person or not, the story changes. So, I mean, implicitly, you could be, like, you could always go for people playing for the Insurgency, or you could always go people against the Insurgency, and the game would be programmed that depending on who wins certain fights and how the story continues to carry over, there can be multiple different endings, it can go off in different branching paths and things like that, and basically just really take advantage of the fact that it is a medium and turn it into a more interactive narrative. In doing so, I think you would have to make the regime much more sympathetic, because otherwise no one is going to want to play as them, basically. Like, the Insurgency will still be upheld as the good guys. So therefore you make Superman and Wonder Woman a little bit more understanding. You give the agency to the player so they can kind of choose who ends up winning the outcome, how things go, and then just see what kind of different possible endings come out of that. So in this respect, it makes Injustice 2 incredibly difficult to make, because there are various different ways that the first game could end. So I'm kind of just focusing on Injustice 1, but I do think it would make for a very interesting and explicitly video game way of telling the story, which I think Injustice 2 toyed with, but I don't think it went quite far enough. So yeah, that'd be me.
Yeah, sounds really interesting. Sounds like a lot of work, but it sounds interesting.
Exactly. That is the difficult thing when it comes to interactive narratives, that trying to program many different paths through story is time-consuming and very often not worth it, because most players are barely going to see any of those paths. So, yeah. This is obviously an idealized thing. Thinking in a world we have thousands of people and they can make whatever they want. It's fine. Yeah.
1,000 monkeys on 1,000 typewriters.
Exactly. Yeah.
And an infinite amount of time.
They'll write Shakespeare eventually.
Yep.
Awesome. All right. Shall we move into random talk then?
Sure.
Yeah. What have you got to recommend to us this episode?
I am recommending a YouTube channel.
Oh.
One we have used a lot in the past.
Sure.
As a great little sort of research platform, and also because he's just absolutely hilarious. That's Comic Drake.
Oh, yes. I know Comic Drake.
Yes. He, for those who don't know, is essentially a comic book historian. He finds all these really interesting facts. He delves deep into the research behind a lot of the comics that you read. He asks questions. He had a video very recently at time of recording saying the top 10 Uncle Ben deaths.
The fact that there's been more than 10 kind of speaks to something funny in itself.
But that was a whole interesting look at, like, how Spider-Man's origin has changed or, like, been done across multiple universes across the years. And yes, it's a bit of a joke title, but the heart of it is very, like, contemplative and very story-focused. And I find it really good. And it's also, we use it a lot as just sort of a jumping-off platform, because he knows a lot more than your average Wikipedia article when it comes to that. And he's a great way to sort of go off, because he'll give you all these little smaller comics or things you wouldn't think about as ways to go. And then from there, you can just spread out and follow your own research. And yeah, he is absolutely fantastic. Highly recommend everyone go watch him.
Yeah, awesome. And I think especially when it's becoming more difficult with comic book stuff now, because comics is basically, as a medium, is just kind of it's literally just churning out things to be adapted into other mediums, like film and video games and television and things like that. So I really think a lot of the time the basic comic books go underappreciated, which is a shame, because there are so many amazing stories there that are worth discovering, as you say. So yeah, no, awesome. I would second that. I'm going to do something related to Superman 2, where I'm just going to recommend the film adaptation of What's So Funny About Truth, Justice, in the American Way.
Nice.
Superman versus the Elite. We talked about this in the episode itself, but I think, especially for me, who's someone who's always tended to find Superman a little bit uninteresting and old-fashioned, this story does a really, really great job of showing why he is still compelling character in the modern age. in a lot of very interesting ways. As you say, Manchester Black and the new characters are really great. It kind of turns Superman into not necessarily an antagonist, but he grapples more with his sense of self and sense of a person, which I think is always the best Superman stories very often do. And I would definitely recommend it to anyone. Even if you don't like Superman too much, I feel like you might get quite a bit out of it. So, yeah.
I find myself quoting that movie so many times.
It's very, very good.
Especially the final act.
Oh, it's so good. Yeah. Yeah, but anyway, you should definitely see Superman versus the Elite. So,
yes.
Cool. Well, thank you to everyone who listened to this episode of Medium Shift. We can be found at mediumshift@gmail.com. Feel free to send in whatever recommendations, suggestions, ratings, reviews, whatever you want. Feel free to rate us on whatever platform of your choice. It always helps. Next episode, we are going to be sticking with the video game theme in some ways, but this time taking it underground.
We're doing Super Mario Bros.
Yeah, see what I did there? Like pipes, like it's literally under... Yeah. It's very stupid.
Let's go and finish this episode.
All right, until next time, fare thee well.
Woohoo!